Hello, today we will discuss stylistic periods and the composers who mastered them. Now you may ask yourself, why do I need to know about stylistic time periods? Well, ask yourself, why do cowboys ride horses instead of cars? The time periods in which we live affect aspects of our everyday life, such as clothing, tools, laws, even musical styles. The stylistic time periods which we will discuss are the medieval era, Renaissance era, Baroque era, classical era, Romantic era, and the modern era. The medieval era spanned from 400 AD to 1400 AD. The two genres of music were sacred music and secular music. Music was taught orally, and only sacred music was notated. No music, however, was printed until the 15th century. A Gregorian chant is a type of sacred music that was used during this time period. It was the only music allowed in church. It must be kept pure and simple. It was a Latin text sung by monks in unison, unaccompanied with no musical instruments. It had a flexible rhythm, a narrow range of voices, and it was monophonic in texture. There were no skips or leaps to the voices that performed this music. Here is an example of a Gregorian chant. A scampi is a form of secular music. It was composed by nobles, but performed by troubadours, trouvères, as well as minstrels. It had a strong beat, and it was sang in the language of the people. It did have accompaniment by musical instruments, and it was for dancing and spinning. It was very important in social functions, and it spoke of love and crusade. Here is an example of a scampi music.
The Renaissance musical era spanned from 1400 AD to 1600 AD, and here are just a few of the musicians who composed during this time period. During the Renaissance time, the church choirs were still all male. The choirs were larger now, however, and musicians received higher pay. Composers wanted credit for their work. Italy was the center of music, and word painting became popular. Voice imitation was popular as well, and there was a wider range used by voices, and the flow of the music was gentle, with a few large leaps. The Baroque musical era spanned from 1600 to 1750 AD. Here are a few of the composers who performed during this time period. It is said that the death of Johann Bach marked the ending of the Baroque period. During the Baroque musical era, church music was more elaborate. Music was mostly only heard at church, but was now taught outside of the church. The texture of the music was homophonic and polyphonic. Chords were now used to make sounds fuller. Patterns during the music was often repeated. There was a driving rhythm, and melody lines were now important. Also added to music during this time period was a basso continuum, and most music was very elaborate. Here is an example of Jesus' Joy of Man's Desiring.
The classical era spanned from 1750 to 1825 AD. Here are a few of the musicians popular during this time period. During the classical era, music had a variety of contrasting moods. Changes could now be both gradual or sudden. Rhythms were flexible, and there were unexpected pauses during a performance. Music texture was homophonic. It was more tuneful now. There was a balanced sound with gradual dynamic change. The Romantic era spanned from 1820 AD to 1900 AD, and here are a few of the composers who composed during this time period. During the Romantic era, music was more personal, and the melodies had a sing-songy texture to them. Program music had become popular, and themes reoccurred throughout the piece. Nationalism was now important, and there was more variety to music, and pieces were much longer. Orchestras were larger, and composers often used folk songs and legends in their tunes. Music was more dramatic, and the piano and violin were used more. The modern musical time era spanned from 1900 AD to current times. Here are a few of the composers who composed during this time period. During the modern era, you will notice that there was a break in tradition. More unique systems were used. Composers were more adventurous, and they incorporated music from different cultures. Chords were now used more. During this time period, a riot was caused because of the unique presentation of Stravinsky's work. We now see African American composers, and music is inspired by older music. There's now a larger percussion influence, and there are also new ways of organizing rhythm. Music has changed from the Gregorian chants and the scampi music to Jesus' Joy of Man's Desiring by Bach to the riot-provoking music by Stravinsky, and then our African American composers, as in William Grant Still. How will you influence the next generation of music? All right, class, time for a pop quiz. Let's see what you've learned. Go ahead and pull out.
Created using Powtoon.